"I can't marry you, Victoria," Marcus Sterling said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the cathedral filled with 400 of Manhattan's elite, as every camera broadcasting to millions captured the exact moment a 34-year-old billionaire in a custom Armani tuxedo pointed directly at a homeless woman standing frozen in the back doorway, wearing nothing but a tattered gray coat and worn sneakers, her honey-brown skin streaked with tears she didn't even know she was crying. The collective gasp from the congregation seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, and Victoria Ashford, heiress to a media empire, draped in a $200,000 Vera Wang gown, felt her manicured fingers go numb as the bouquet of white roses slipped from her grasp and scattered across the marble floor. In that single devastating moment, Marcus risked losing everything: his $4.7 billion empire built on family legacy, his reputation cultivated over a decade, every business partnership that hinged on this strategic marriage, and the only life he'd ever known among New York's aristocracy. But the question burning through every mind in that sacred space, the mystery that would haunt headlines for months to come, was simply this: who was this mysterious woman with the sad brown eyes and trembling hands, and what impossible connection could she possibly share with a man who owned half the city skyline? Victoria's scream of rage pierced the stunned silence as she lunged toward Marcus, her perfectly styled blonde hair coming undone, mascara already streaming down her porcelain cheeks, but Marcus was no longer looking at her at all. The homeless woman, her name was Elena Reyes, though Marcus hadn't known that when he'd first seen her 3 months ago, stumbled backward as if his words had physically struck her. She was 31 years old, with long dark hair that hadn't seen proper care in months, pulled back in a messy braid that couldn't hide its former beauty. Her caramel complexion, weathered by nights spent on cold park benches, still held an undeniable warmth. The gray coat she wore was 3 sizes too large, hiding a frame that had grown too thin from missed meals, and her brown eyes, those eyes that had stopped Marcus Sterling dead in his tracks on a rainy Tuesday in Central Park, were wide with absolute terror and confusion. "Security!" Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with humiliation and fury. "Get that vagrant out of my wedding!" But Marcus was already moving, abandoning the altar, pushing past his horrified parents, Richard and Catherine Sterling, whose combined net worth could purchase small nations, and striding down the aisle like a man possessed. His best man, investment banker Thomas Reed, grabbed his arm desperately. "Marcus, have you lost your mind? You're throwing away the merger, the company, everything your father built." Marcus shook him off without breaking stride, his steel-gray eyes locked on Elena as she turned to flee into the September afternoon. 3 months earlier, Marcus Sterling had been the man everyone envied and no one truly knew. At 34, with sharp features, olive skin inherited from his Italian grandmother, and silver-gray eyes that boardrooms had learned to fear, he commanded every room he entered. His dark hair, always perfectly styled, his tailored suits worth more than most people's cars, his penthouse overlooking Central Park, these were the armor he wore against a world that only wanted pieces of him. His engagement to Victoria Ashford had been announced with champagne toasts and stock price increases. It was, everyone agreed, a perfect match, 2 empires joining, a fairy tale written in contracts and prenuptial agreements. But on that rainy Tuesday, everything changed. Marcus had dismissed his driver, choosing to walk through Central Park despite the drizzle, a rare moment of solitude in a life scheduled down to 15-minute increments. He'd been on his phone, arguing about quarterly projections, when he'd nearly tripped over her. Elena was huddled on a bench, soaked through, sharing the last of her bread with a stray dog as skinny as she was. She'd looked up at him, not with the recognition that usually lit people's eyes when they saw Marcus Sterling, not with the hunger for his money or connections, but with something that stopped his heart entirely. "Sorry," she'd said, moving to gather her meager belongings, a worn backpack, a thin blanket, a paperback novel so water-damaged the title was illegible. "I'll get out of your way." But Marcus couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Because looking into her eyes, he felt something he'd spent 34 years convinced didn't exist, an inexplicable, bone-deep recognition of a soul that somehow matched his own. Wait, he'd managed, and then, not knowing what else to do, the billionaire sat down on that wet park bench beside a homeless woman and said simply, "Tell me your story." Elena had laughed, a sound so unexpected and genuine that it cracked something open in Marcus's carefully constructed chest. "You don't want to hear that," she'd said. "Trust me. It's not a pretty one." But she'd looked at him then, really looked, past the expensive watch and the cashmere coat, past the power and the privilege, and she'd seen something that made her continue. "But I guess, maybe you look like someone who needs to hear a not pretty story today." And so she'd told him, about the teaching degree she'd earned while working 3 jobs, about the fiancé who'd emptied her bank accounts and vanished, about the medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment that had devoured everything she had, about the slow, terrible slide from struggling to surviving to simply existing on the margins of a city that had no room for her anymore. What Elena didn't tell him that first day, what she wouldn't tell him until much later, was the secret that connected their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. A secret that, when revealed, would shake the very foundations of the Sterling Empire. Marcus returned to that bench every day for 2 weeks, telling his assistant he was in walking meetings, telling Victoria he was at the gym. He brought coffee, not fancy lattes but simple, warm cups that Elena could wrap her cold fingers around. He brought sandwiches she pretended she wasn't desperate to eat. He brought books to replace her ruined one, choosing titles at random until she laughed and confessed she'd been trying to read Pride and Prejudice for the 8th time when the rain had destroyed it. He brought her a proper coat, not too expensive, nothing that would make her feel like a charity case, just warm and the right size and the exact shade of blue that made her brown eyes glow. "Why are you doing this?" Elena finally asked on day 15, her voice thick with suspicion and something terrifyingly close to hope. "What do you want from me?" Marcus had no answer that made sense. He was engaged to one of the most beautiful, powerful women in New York. He had everything a man could want, everything the world told him to want. But sitting on that park bench, watching Elena's careful smile break through her guarded expression, he felt more alive than he had in decades of boardrooms and galas and champagne-soaked success. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it surprised them both. "I just know that when I'm here, with you, I feel like myself for the first time in my life." Elena had stared at him for a long moment, this mysterious man in his expensive clothes who kept returning to her bench like she was something worth returning to. And then, against every survival instinct she developed in 18 months on the streets, she let herself trust him, just a little, just enough to nod and say, "Okay." Then stay a while longer. Their connection deepened in ways neither expected. Marcus learned that Elena had been valedictorian of her high school class, had dreamed of teaching literature to underprivileged kids, had spent 5 years actually doing it before her world collapsed. Elena learned that Marcus had never wanted to be a billionaire, he'd wanted to be an architect, had filled notebooks with building designs as a teenager before his father had laughed at the idea and enrolled him in business school. She showed him the sketches she still did on scraps of paper, buildings she'd imagined, homes she'd designed in her mind during long nights trying to stay warm. He showed her the architectural drawings still hidden in his desk drawer, the dreams he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed until she asked him who he really was. "You're not what I expected," Elena told him one evening, as the sun set over Central Park and painted the city in shades of gold. "A billionaire who hates his own company. An engaged man who sits on park benches with homeless women. What's your secret, Marcus Sterling?" He'd turned to her then, the fading light catching the silver in his eyes, and he'd told her something he'd never told another living soul, not Victoria, not his therapist, not the business partners who'd known him for decades. "My father built this empire on a lie," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the city sounds. "He destroyed someone to do it. Someone who trusted him, who helped him, who deserved better. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of something that was never worthy of me. And until I met you, Elena, I thought that was all I would ever be. The heir to a stolen throne." Elena's face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Her hands had begun to tremble around her paper coffee cup. And when she spoke, Her voice was barely a whisper that Marcus had to lean close to hear. "Marcus, what was the name of the person your father destroyed?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with premonition, and Marcus, brilliant in boardrooms but oblivious to what was coming, answered without hesitation, "His name was David Reyes. He was my father's original business partner. He trusted my father with everything, and my father—" Marcus stopped, because Elena had dropped her coffee cup entirely, brown liquid pooling on the ground, her whole body shaking with a sudden, violent tremor. "Elena? What's wrong?" "David Reyes," Elena repeated, her voice cracking on each syllable, "was my father." Cliffhanger 1. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He reached for her, but Elena scrambled backward off the bench, her worn sneakers slipping on the wet grass, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Was it horror? Betrayal? Something even more complicated? "Your family destroyed mine," Elena gasped, tears streaming down her honey-brown cheeks. "My father died believing he was a failure. My mother worked herself into an early grave trying to pay his debts your family created. And all this time, all these weeks, you've been what? Amusing yourself? Clearing your conscience?" Marcus's mind raced, piecing together fragments of stories he'd heard as a child. David Reyes, his father's original partner, had been bought out, or so Marcus had always been told. But Elena's anguished words painted a different picture: betrayal, stolen patents, forged documents, a man destroyed so completely that his family had never recovered. "I didn't know," Marcus said, rising to his feet, desperate for her to believe him. "Elena, I swear to you, I didn't know who you were. I didn't know any of this." But she was already running, disappearing into the growing darkness of Central Park, and Marcus, for all his power, for all his billions, couldn't seem to make his feet move fast enough to follow her. He looked for her for weeks. Hired private investigators who searched every shelter, every underpass, every hidden corner of the city where homeless populations gathered. Victoria demanded to know why he'd become so distracted, why he'd cancelled meetings, why he'd lost interest in wedding planning details. His father watched him with suspicious eyes, and Marcus wondered, with growing horror, how much the old man knew about David Reyes and what had really happened 30 years ago. The truth came out in pieces, extracted from old documents and former employees who'd kept quiet for decades. Richard Sterling hadn't just bought out David Reyes. He'd stolen his designs, falsified patent applications, and used his connections to ensure that David would never work in engineering again. The foundation of the Sterling Empire was rotten to its core, built on the broken dreams of a man who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong person. Marcus confronted his father in the library of the Sterling estate, surrounded by leather-bound books and ancestral portraits, all the trappings of a legacy now revealed as poison. "You destroyed an innocent man," Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage. "You stole everything he had and left his family to suffer." Richard Sterling, silver-haired and imperious at 70, had simply shrugged. "That's business, son. David was brilliant but weak. He would have given everything away, and I would have had nothing to show for my work. I did what I had to do to build this family's future." "Your future? At what cost?" Marcus demanded. "His wife died in poverty. His daughter," he couldn't finish. Couldn't say Elena's name in this room, in this house, surrounded by everything that had been bought with her family's suffering. Richard's eyes had narrowed. "His daughter? What do you know about his daughter?" But Marcus was already leaving, slamming doors that had never been slammed in Sterling history, knowing with absolute certainty that he could no longer be part of this corrupted inheritance, not without trying to make things right. It took another month to find Elena. She'd left the city entirely, hitchhiked north, ended up in a small town in Connecticut where a church shelter had given her a bed and a temporary job cleaning. Marcus had driven there himself, no driver, no entourage, just a man desperately seeking a woman who had every reason to hate him. When he'd walked into that church basement, Elena had looked up from the table she was wiping down, and the expression on her face had nearly broken him entirely. "Please," Marcus said, before she could speak, before she could tell him to leave. "Just let me talk. 5 minutes. And if you never want to see me again after that, I'll go and I won't come back." Elena had stood frozen, the cleaning rag clutched in her hands, her proud shoulders tense with distrust. But something in his voice, or perhaps something in her own heart that she couldn't quite silence, made her nod once, briefly, and sit down at one of the shelter's plastic tables. Marcus told her everything. Not just what his father had done, but what he was planning to do about it. He'd hired lawyers to uncover the full extent of the fraud. He'd documented every stolen design, every forged signature, every manipulated patent filing. He was going to expose his own father, knowing it would likely cost him his position in the company, his inheritance, everything he'd been raised to become. "But I'm also going to do more than that," Marcus continued, his gray eyes never leaving Elena's face. "I'm setting up a foundation, the David Reyes Foundation, that will provide full restitution plus 30 years of interest and damages to your family. That means you, Elena. And I'm establishing grant programs in your father's name for young engineers from underprivileged backgrounds. His legacy will finally be honored the way it should have been from the beginning." Elena's eyes had filled with tears, her walls crumbling despite her best efforts to maintain them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you destroy your own life to fix what your father did?" Marcus had reached across the table then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and gently taken her hands in his. "Because I love you, Elena. I didn't plan to. I didn't ask to. But somewhere between that first conversation on a park bench and the moment you ran away from me, you became the most important person in my world. And loving you means I can't be the man my father wanted me to be. I have to become the man I was always supposed to be, the one who would have made your father proud to call him a friend." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Then, so quietly Marcus had to lean forward to hear, "I'm not ready to forgive. Not yet. Not completely." Marcus nodded, understanding. "I'm not asking you to forgive. I'm asking you to let me try to earn it. However long it takes." And Elena, her heart at war with her history, had squeezed his hands once and said, "Okay. Try." The months that followed were the hardest Marcus had ever lived through, and somehow, the most meaningful. Victoria had raged when he tried to break off their engagement privately, threatening to destroy him socially, to expose invented scandals, to turn every powerful family in New York against him. His father had cut him off entirely, frozen his personal accounts, tried to have him removed from the board of Sterling Industries. Business partners who'd shaken his hand for years suddenly couldn't return his calls. But Marcus had prepared. He had allies he'd cultivated quietly, executives who'd grown uncomfortable with Richard Sterling's methods, board members who suspected the company's foundations weren't entirely solid. And he had Elena, not as a partner yet, not as a lover, but as a friend who reminded him daily why he was fighting. She'd moved back to the city when the David Reyes Foundation became a reality, no longer homeless but living modestly in a small apartment Marcus had insisted was part of the restitution, not charity. She'd started teaching again, part-time at first, at a community center in the Bronx where kids who'd never had anyone believe in them learned that books could unlock worlds. Marcus visited when she let him, keeping careful distance, never pushing, simply present in a way that slowly wore down her resistance. "You're still engaged to her," Elena said one evening, 3 weeks before the wedding date that Victoria refused to cancel. They were sitting in Elena's tiny kitchen, drinking tea from mismatched mugs, and the elephant in the room had finally demanded attention. Marcus set down his cup carefully. "I've tried to end it 6 times. She keeps telling the press it's just pre-wedding stress. My lawyers say forcing the issue could get complicated, especially with everything else I'm dealing with legally." "So you're going to marry her?" Elena asked, her voice carefully neutral, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug.
"No," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not."
Victoria knows that, even if she won't accept it publicly. The only question is how ugly she's going to make it when the truth becomes undeniable. Elena had looked up then, meeting his eyes, and something in her expression shifted from guarded to vulnerable. And after? When all of this is over? What then, Marcus? He'd wanted to cross the small kitchen, to take her in his arms, to tell her that after meant forever, meant waking up beside her, meant building something real from the ashes of his destroyed inheritance. But they weren't there yet. She wasn't ready. So he simply said, "Then I spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you. Whether you ever decide I am or not." The morning of the wedding, Marcus woke up knowing exactly what he was going to do. He'd spent 6 months watching his father's lawyers try to bury the truth, watching Victoria plan a wedding he'd explicitly refused, watching his entire world rearrange itself around a single, impossible love. The press release exposing Richard Sterling's fraud was scheduled to go public at noon. The foundation in David Reyes's name was fully funded and legally ironclad. And in 3 hours, Marcus would walk into St. Patrick's Cathedral and end his engagement in front of everyone who had ever believed the Sterling family was untouchable. What he hadn't expected was Elena. He hadn't told her about the wedding, hadn't wanted her anywhere near Victoria's sphere of cruelty. But Elena had seen the coverage. Had watched the limousines pull up on television screens in store windows. Had felt something pulling her toward that cathedral with a force she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. She'd walked there from her apartment, still wearing her everyday clothes, the blue coat Marcus had given her, now worn with dignity rather than desperation, and had slipped through the cathedral doors just as the ceremony began. Marcus had seen her the moment she appeared. Had felt her presence like a shift in gravity. And when the priest asked if there was any reason these two should not be wed, Marcus had done something that would make headlines around the world. He'd stopped his own wedding, not because anyone objected, but because he finally, fully understood what love meant and what it demanded. Cliffhanger 2. Security. Victoria screamed again, her beautiful face twisted with fury. "I want her arrested." But Marcus had already reached Elena, had already taken her trembling hands in his, had already turned his back on 400 guests and a future that had never really been his. "I know what you're going to say," Elena whispered, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice shaking. "Marcus, you can't, not like this, not in front of everyone," but Marcus shook his head, raising one hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "I've spent my whole life doing what I was supposed to do, Elena. Today, I'm doing what I know is right. Today, I'm choosing love, real love, over everything else. How dare you?" Victoria's voice cut through the moment, and suddenly she was there, her wedding gown billowing around her like angry clouds, her manicured finger jabbing toward Elena. "You think you can just waltz in here and steal my fiancé? You're nothing. You're a homeless nobody who..." "She's everything," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but carrying the authority of a man who'd finally found his truth. "And she's worth more than all the power and money in this room combined." He turned to the assembled guests, the politicians and celebrities, the business titans and society matrons, all frozen in various stages of shock. "In 1 hour, you're going to receive news about Sterling Industries and my father's legacy that will change everything you think you know. I'm telling you now so you can prepare. The foundation of this empire was built on stolen dreams and destroyed lives. And I refuse to continue the lie." Richard Sterling rose from his seat in the front row, his face purple with rage. "You ungrateful, if you do this, you'll have nothing. No inheritance, no position, no family name worth carrying." Marcus looked at his father, really looked, perhaps for the first time without the filter of obligation and fear, and felt nothing but pity. "I'll have my integrity. I'll have the chance to make things right. And if she'll have me, I'll have the love of a woman who sees who I really am, not what I can give her." He turned back to Elena, dropping to one knee right there in the middle of the cathedral aisle, surrounded by chaos and cameras and a future completely uncertain. "Elena Reyes," Marcus said, his voice steady despite everything, I have no ring to offer you. After today, I may have no company, no fortune, nothing but my own 2 hands and whatever I can rebuild from scratch. But I love you with everything I am, and I believe we were meant to find each other, not despite our family's history, but because of it. Because maybe this is how broken things finally get healed. So I'm asking you, right here, in front of everyone, will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you? Will you be my wife? The cathedral had gone completely silent. Even Victoria had stopped screaming, frozen in disbelief. Elena looked down at this man, this impossible, complicated, unexpectedly wonderful man, and felt 31 years of struggle and loss and loneliness crack open to reveal something bright and terrifying and true. Yes, she whispered, and then, louder, for everyone to hear, yes, Marcus. I'll marry you. The chaos that followed would fill tabloids for months. Victoria collapsed in theatrical hysterics and was carried out by her mortified parents. Richard Sterling stormed out, already calling lawyers. Half the guests fled before the scandal could touch them, the other half stayed, riveted by a love story more compelling than any they'd witnessed in their privileged lives. But Marcus and Elena saw none of it. They walked out of that cathedral hand in hand, flashbulbs exploding around them, and stepped into the September sunshine together. Behind them, a world of wealth and power crumbled. Ahead of them, nothing was certain except each other. The next year wasn't easy. Richard Sterling fought the exposure with every resource he had, but the evidence was undeniable. The resulting legal battle stripped him of his position and his reputation, though his lawyers managed to keep him out of prison. Sterling Industries restructured under new leadership, with Marcus serving as an advisor focused on ethical practices rather than profit margins. The David Reyes Foundation flourished, providing scholarships and grants to hundreds of aspiring engineers who would never have had a chance otherwise. Marcus and Elena married 6 months after the cathedral incident, in a small ceremony at the church shelter where he'd found her in Connecticut. She wore a simple white dress, he wore a suit he'd bought off the rack. 37 people attended, shelter workers, former students Elena had taught, new friends they'd made together. Not a single member of New York society was invited. Elena went back to teaching full-time, eventually becoming the principal of a charter school dedicated to giving underprivileged kids the education they deserved. Marcus, true to his childhood dreams, went back to school for architecture. At 35, he was the oldest student in his program and, by his own account, the happiest. They bought a small house in Brooklyn with money Elena had inherited from the foundation restitution, modest by Sterling standards, perfect by their own. On their first anniversary, Marcus took Elena back to that bench in Central Park where they'd met. It was raining again, just as it had been that first Tuesday, and they sat together under an umbrella he'd remembered to bring this time. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Giving up everything you had?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the rain fall on the city that had once belonged to him. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "What I had before wasn't real," he said. "It was a castle built on someone else's pain. What I have now, this life, this love, this chance to be who I was always meant to be, this is everything. You're everything, Elena. You always were." She turned to look at him, her brown eyes filled with a peace she'd never expected to feel. "I love you, Marcus Sterling." "I love you too, Elena Sterling." And there, on a rainy park bench where a billionaire had once sat down beside a homeless woman and asked her to tell him her story, 2 people who'd found each other against impossible odds kissed under an umbrella while the city rushed by, oblivious to the miracle happening in their midst. Some love stories begin in ballrooms and end in tragedy. Others begin in rain-soaked parks and end in a kind of joy that can only come from 2 broken people choosing, every single day, to heal together. Marcus and Elena's story was the second kind, imperfect, unexpected, and more beautiful for all the pain it had transformed. Touched your heart? Please hit like and subscribe to join our family of dreamers who believe that true love can conquer even the darkest histories. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their story isn't over yet, and the best chapter might be just around the corner. Because sometimes, the person who changes your whole life is waiting on a park bench in the rain, and all you have to do is be brave enough to sit down and listen. If this story of impossible love and redemption